Ratchet, thank you very much for that. And I think it probably makes sense now, for Anubhav to say a few words in relation to the validity of e-commerce transactions to follow up from what Ratchet has just said. If I could just invite Anubhav to say a few words. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Legal validity of e-commerce transactions, the big questions being faced by all e-commerce companies, banks. I'm representing Standard Chartered Bank here. I guess banks started off with this. I mean, it's obvious that we did before the e-commerce companies came in, and we decided to take the step of making the online platform available to customers, and let's see how it goes. So let's try and find out what is the big deal about e-commerce transactions as compared to normal transaction, right? Are they really different in any sense? Both are contracts. Okay, let's try and boil down contract to the most basic element. It's when two parties agree upon the same thing in the same sense, right? I go to an e-commerce site, I decide to buy a black shirt of X brand and pay Y amount for it, right? That's the agreement we've reached, no confusion. That's a contract. A contract can even be concluded orally. There need not be a written agreement. So what's the harm in actually having a site which has a laid down process, a mechanism which is set, log files getting stored throughout the day, and people transacting on it? Both are recognized under law. Of course, written agreements, stamped, signed, sealed, authorized representative, authorized signatories, we know everything, how that works, right? It's very simple. But again, as I mentioned, even oral contracts are recognized under the Indian Contract Act. So why not an email exchange between two people? That's also a contract. The very fact that the Information Technology Act came about and started recognizing digital signatures, later on went on to define what is an electronic signature, which is slightly wider meaning, which I'll come to later, is in a way, the legislature is recognizing that yes, online transactions do happen and they need to be recognized under law. Whether sufficient progress had been made in that respect is a question we still don't know the answer to that. I mean, obviously I feel sufficient progress has not been made. Okay, thank you. Sorry, can you just help me with this? I don't know how to move to the next slide. So it's actually just a very basic presentation, not much to distract anyone. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so obviously both can lead to disputes, right? I mean, who is to say that a written agreement is not going to lead to a dispute? Similarly, any contract concluded online is obviously, there's every possibility of leading to a dispute again there. Again, so what's the difference, right? Let's see, how do we authenticate these transactions? This is where the difference actually lies. Now, the courts in India have at various points of time categorically held that identifying a signature match or identifying a thumb impression match is an exact science. There is no scope for variation. It's 100% exact science. Is there such recognition for any of these? Let's see. Card and PIN, probably the oldest mechanism of widespread usage of electronic transactions, right? Banks issuing cards, customer having ATM pins, withdrawing money. It's an electronic transaction. Valid? Very much so. I mean, we do it every day. Proving it, that's the other part of it. User ID and password. 2001, RBI comes out with the first real regulation on this, recognizing that yes, banks can try and provide electronic banking services. We needed to take approval from them. This was all, of course, happening in the light of the Information Technology Act of 2000. And it wasn't a clear-cut sign-off by the RBI in any way, saying that if you have a user ID, if you have a PIN, if you do this, it's going to be fine. They just said, yes, you can use various modes of authentication, which would include user ID, PIN. Biometric was recognized as far back as then, but how far have we progressed in it really? Not much. Registered number, one-time password. This is a new thing in fashion, right? Everyone on internet banking is supposed to have a mobile number. Unless you have a mobile number, we probably decline to provide you with internet banking services. The number of frauds that are happening, the number of phishing cases that banks face when people get called or people get emailed to try and extract the confidential, sensitive information out of them. To try and prevent all of this, banks, as advised by RBI, came out with a third parameter, which is this registered number and one-time password. Or say in case of ICICI Bank, they have a grid on the reverse of your debit card. Biometric authentication, of course, Aadhaar, everyone knows about it, what we do. But again, very, very limited usage. We're obviously trying to use it in the banking sector a little more. There's this concept of doing everything, the know your customer checks online, linking your servers with UIDAI, which is linked to the Aadhaar, and it's fancy stuff happening there. But still, there is no legal recognition of this. The only thing which is recognized is digital signature, the most complicated of all possibly and the most rarely used. So this is what is recognized on the Information Technology Act. Section 3, subsection 2 talks about digital signature as way back as 2001. It's as complicated probably as it sounds, hash, crypto, asymmetric, and I can't even remember those terms, right? So that was digital signature getting recognition back in 2001. Let's see what's happened since then. 8 years pass on, nothing happens. 2009, amendment comes about, talks about something called electronic signature, section 3, capital A introduced. What does it say? It should be reliable. It should be specified in the second schedule of the Information Technology Act 2000. Okay, fine. This is not an either or scenario. It's and. So both conditions have to be satisfied. So it includes digital signature that is clarified in the definition of electronic signature, but let's see what it actually can lead to. So specifying in the second schedule is totally dependent on the legislature. What the Act has already provided for is the reliability criteria, right? As I said, the courts have recognized that signature by hand or thumb impression, detecting that and making sure it matches with the person who actually owns it or who can use it, who applies it, that's 100% accurate science. So ideally, that's what the legislature would be trying to move here as well, right? That's the direction they want to move in. So they try and lay down very, very strict criteria. It should be linked to the signatory and no other, right? First point, the signature is ideally, of course, barring instances of forgery, supposed to be linked to only the person who owns it or who uses it. It is under the control of the signatory. Of course, if I have something unique to me, but someone else can also use it, it loses its uniqueness. So that's what, again, thumb impression, yes. Signature, because courts have recognized it, yes. Let's talk about digital signature here, just for a moment, digressing from it. I mean, is it really certain that a digital signature is always under the control of the signatory? Is it not possible, just like a signature can be forged, that your digital signature token can be lost, misplaced, stolen, right? It is possible. But the benefit that digital signature has got is, by virtue of being recognized under the Information Technology Act, we won't really have to go into great depths to prove it. Any alteration made to the signature is detectable. Yes, goes without saying. If you write a check and if your signature has been overwritten on, it should be detectable. Banks do it all the time using ultraviolet light and all the jazzy stuff. Any alteration made to the data is detectable. Let me just quickly explain this a little bit. Say nowadays people are moving to using something called, and it's a form of an electronic signature where someone just signs on the screen of a tab or the screen of a mobile phone. Some of the courier companies have moved to this model, right? But who is to say that yes, the signature was placed here at this point of time, but the data surrounding it has not got changed later? How do you prove that? Do we have actually come up with that level of technology to ensure that this does not happen? Extremely. Now imagine going and proving this before a court of law. How difficult that is going to be. Right? So that's essentially what this is about, that yes, there are things which are recognized in law, but proving them factually, maintaining records and files is such a big question mark right now that every such transaction is a potential risk.
Anubhav, thank you very much for that overview. And I'd like to invite my last speaker, Tushar. Tushar is going to be speaking about taxation in general, and no doubt he's going to be touching on indirect tax issues and also potentially direct tax issues which affect the industry. Thank you, Tushar.
Thank you, Ryan. Very good afternoon to everyone. Colleagues from the legal fraternity and noted guests from the industry. Now, as we all know, e-commerce has completely transformed the manner in which business is carried out. You're sitting in a remote location. You press one button and you can get whatever services you need, and even goods from any part of the world. Now, what has happened because of this is that the inherent and the traditional requirement of taxing a business was always an existence of a permanent establishment. What you tax are profits attributable to a physical presence. Now that existence of a physical presence has been completely eliminated by e-commerce. To give you a very simple example is that I am sitting in Delhi and I get onto an e-portal. Now the server of that e-portal says in the US. I buy goods which have been manufactured, say in Brazil. The goods currently are warehoused in China and they get delivered. Now what has happened in this entire transaction is that we really don't know where is the physical presence of the company which is doing the business. Who taxes this? Now these are the questions, these are the tax challenges that every country is now facing globally. As a matter of fact, the G20 countries have requested the OECD to prepare an action plan to determine how profits of a business can be taxed on the basis of the economic value. So there are suggestions made by all stakeholders. Every government has this agenda of revamping the international rules of taxation. Now, especially in the context of India, the situation is very murky, to say the least, which is because of our federal structure today, currently. What happens is, as we all are aware, we've got subjects of taxation in India. Certain subjects are under the exclusive legislative competence of the center, and certain subjects go to the states. Now, specifically with respect to sale, I'm just giving the fundamental principles, and then we'll try to fit it into the current transactions that are driven over the e-portals. So what happens is that Article 286 of our Constitution says that no law of the state shall impose a tax on goods which are either imported into India or are exported out of India. Similarly, Article 269 states that no law of the state will legislate on a sale which is in the course of interstate movement, which is when goods move from one geographical boundary of a state to another. Only the center can do that. Now, the principles which determine as to which state can tax the interstate movement is under a law which is the Central Sales Tax Act, enacted in 1956. Now, a lot of things have changed since then, but those principles still apply, and that's why we encounter a lot of difficulties. What is today happened in India is that we've got an origin-based tax, which means that if I buy goods and the situs of the goods, say today, is in Maharashtra, I'm sitting in Delhi, I get onto a website, I order those goods. Now, the Central Sales Tax Act, which determines the principles, states that if pursuant to a contract of sale, there are occasions of movement from one state to another, then what you have to pay is a levy that goes to the central government but administratively collected by the state. Whereas if the sale commences and ends within the territorial boundaries, the geographical boundaries of one state, what you pay today is a local levy, which is VAT. That comes under the plenary jurisdiction of the state. Now, what happens because of that is that every state would want their fair share of return. Our original line of thought in indirect taxes was that if production is attributable to a state, then that state should not allow those goods to move out unless taxes in those states are paid. So if I give you an example, suppose I get onto a portal of Amazon. I'm sitting in Delhi, I get goods from Maharashtra. Now, because I have given a request, Amazon sends that request, say, to the merchant. And because of my request, there is a movement. And that movement will result in a transfer from Maharashtra to Delhi. There will be a central sales tax payable. Now, the fact is that it is very important both for the buyer and the e-portal to understand what is their liability. Because transaction taxes in India currently go up till 35–40%. Contractually, you can decide who bears the burden of transaction taxes. If your contracts are silent, the general rule is that the consumer bears the burden. But the statutory liability is always on the seller. So if you don't factor which tax has to be paid, then if there is any increase, that has to be borne by the business. Now, if we take another example, which is, as Amazon has done and certain other players, to have an efficient way of distribution, you are creating warehouses. So you have a warehouse, say, to cater to northern India in Gurgaon. I'm in Delhi. I order a product which is of someone from Maharashtra but lying in Gurgaon. Now what happens is that because the movement of this product is from Gurgaon to Delhi, but the actual seller is Maharashtra, which state will get the tax? The fact is Haryana will get the tax because the goods were lying in the state of Haryana and someone from Maharashtra would have stock transferred. Now because of all these complex reasons, what has happened is that every state wants to tax either the intermediary or the seller. If the state doesn't have the information of the actual sellers, what they are trying to do is, which is a live example of Karnataka, there's an e-portal which has created a fulfillment center. They come and stock all their goods in Karnataka. Karnataka government says that when a customer requests for your goods, it is you who supplies the goods. The goods are lying in your warehouse. So when you are selling these goods, you are an agent of the principal, and therefore you have to pay the tax. And because of this, the intermediary, who has no rule, because the taxable event is a transfer of property in goods, and that transfer happens from the merchant. They have no liability, but still, because there's a huge chunk of tax which a state government sees, and that's a subject under their exclusive jurisdiction, they are starting to initiate proceedings. Now, what Karnataka is planning to do is that because they really don't know who's consuming what, they've asked the e-portals, they're planning to get a new provision that whenever the e-portal pays back to the merchant, then they have to deduct or withhold tax and then give the details to the government, state government, so that they come to know who's paying what. So these are the issues that are being currently faced. The problem is that earlier these issues were encountered in a scenario where there were intangibles involved, like service. I'm a lawyer. I'm writing a report for someone who's sitting in Japan. I write the report here. I deliver it outside India. In Japan, he uses this for his business. The question was, in order to tax this, where is the situs of this service? Now, what e-commerce has done is, that this situs concept has now been shifted to goods also. So you'll have to see where exactly are the goods lying at the time you get into a sale. Now, in a GST scenario, which may come in 2016, these taxable events of manufacture, sale, service will be made redundant. And what will be the taxable event will be a supply. And the actual state which is going to get a tax will be where the consumer is sitting. Now, what will happen because of a GST is that on every supply, whatever taxes are required to be paid, a portion of it will go to the central government, one portion to the state governments. Therefore, a distinction between good service will get eliminated. There will be complete fungibility. Everyone will start getting credit. But the only problem is that we really don't see that coming in 2016. Even if it comes, we need a lot of preparations. Industry is not ready. Systems need to get into place. Similarly, for direct taxes, what the governments all over the world are grappling with is that in an e-commerce transaction, which country should tax, because the source is actually coming from the country in which the consumer is sitting. Whereas if the server is located outside India, our courts hold that the servers are regarded as a permanent establishment and they are outside India. So therefore there's no tax. That's why now everyone has got together and are planning to revamp the entire legislation so as to tax companies on the basis of the nexus, on the basis of the source. So we see a lot of judicial intervention in the coming period because our laws are outdated in a way. Most of the principles are in legislations which are backdated, some 56, 1930 and so on and so forth. So there will be a lot of intervention by the courts, and after that, perhaps the government will have to sit and amend laws so as to bring such transactions within their clutches. Thank you.
Tushar, thank you very much for that. I think you perhaps preempted my question, which was perhaps the 64,000 rupee question. Is it how is the GST going to impact the sector? I think we have to wait and see how that space is going to evolve. If I could perhaps just come back to Ratchet for a moment. Ratchet, I wanted you to say a few words about the liability of platform intermediaries in particular, and also perhaps while you do that, I was wondering whether you could draw out from any recent case law any principles which you see which could potentially be applicable to the e-commerce sector going forward. Ratchet?
Yeah, thanks, Ram. Can I just take 10 seconds to, first of all, clarify the only reason why I'm not taking that mic and I'm sitting here is not because of any snobbish value, but only because I'm trying to keep up with the spirit of a panel discussion. So there is no other reason that I'm not taking the mic there. So before I get into this big question of what is the liability of an intermediary, we need to first of all understand what the hell is an intermediary to begin with. So if I were to give you the legal mumbo jumbo, it goes something like any person who provides, stores, transmits an electronic records or provides any service in connection therewith amounts to an intermediary. Simply put, any person who is providing service with respect to third-party content or data qualifies as an intermediary. Whether it's someone like a telco like a Vodafone or an Airtel, a search engine like a Google, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon seems to be very popular here, Flipkart, Snapdeal, all of them, or these online marketplaces also expressly qualify as an intermediary under the Information Technology Act. Now, why is it important to be an intermediary? And when we were initially advising clients, they were like, I don't want to be an intermediary. There is too much compliance that I need to do. But the big advantage of being an intermediary, and this is the closest that we get to a safe harbor, it's a terminology which is used very popularly in the West. This is the closest that you will get to a safe harbor provision. What the Information Technology Act provides for is that an intermediary is not going to be responsible under any law whatsoever with respect to a third-party content or data that is hosted or a service is provided in connection with such third-party data. Like even with the offer of 1 kg gold, there is always a term and condition. So what the catch is that you need to, for you to be able to get that benefit or an immunity of an intermediary, you need to fulfill certain obligations. So for example, you will get the benefit of an intermediary if you are able to demonstrate that you are not the one, first of all, who's owning the content, because you are only supposed to provide the liaison or the connection for a third-party content to be made available. You should not have modified the content, you should not have initiated the transmission, so on and so forth. Another important aspect for you to be able to get this benefit of an immunity under Section 79 of the Information Technology Act is that you need to appoint a grievance officer. So in case any person is aggrieved of any content that may be objectionable, you could reach out to the grievance officer and he could take action within certain stipulated time. So when we say stipulated time, the law identifies that the intermediary needs to react within 36 hours of getting to know. It sounds all very logical, very simple. But the question that the people are finding difficult to answer is that when do these 36 hours begin? Does it begin from the point of time that I get to know that there is something wrong or there is something objectionable? If I receive an email on some mail alias, is that when I get to know? Is it when the grievance officer is informed? Is it that when I get to know? So the important decision, Rand, that you have been referring to is the Supreme Court decision in the Shreya Singhal case. Now, the Shreya Singhal judgment arose in the background when a certain prominent politician, he died, and the whole city of Mumbai was ordered a complete shutdown. So the two minor girls who posted or expressed their displeasure at such a shutdown of Mumbai city upon an unfortunate event, and somebody liked that post. The two minor girls were taken into custody, and there was obviously then a complete public outrage, and there was an emotional situation and a political situation that emerged out of the whole instance. Now what has happened when the court was adjudicating upon the matter related to Section 66A of the Information Technology Act, which talks about publishing comments that are annoying to the public at large. But the last 4 pages out of a 100-page judgment interestingly deal with the liability of an intermediary and when does the clock start ticking or when does the intermediary get to know so that he can react within the next 36 hours. The court has held in those last 4 pages, or those observations have been made, that you can't expect an intermediary like a Facebook or a Google to scan a million postings that have happened in a day and then based on their screening expect them to take action in a jiffy. It is not possible. This is not what they are expected to do, and therefore the 36 hours start running from the point of time that a court of competent jurisdiction has passed a valid order asking for certain content to be removed. Great, sounds logical. But this has now been, and in fact I think some of my brethren are also contributing to this, and while everyone is entitled to have my apologies, and while everyone is entitled to have their opinion and express it, I will do the same. The position that some people are now taking as a result is that until I am served with a court order, no intermediary, and this intermediary will include the online marketplaces also, which is why it's it's relevant for everyone. Your liability gets triggered there, because before that time, there is no liability for an intermediary. So the position is that unless a court order is served on me, which is passed by a court of competent jurisdiction and is validly served on me, the clock never starts ticking. Whatever is there on the website can stay. The problem that I have in accepting a situation like this is that if you were to take a different scenario, here we are talking about where a fundamental right of speech and expression is being curtailed by asking the person to remove the content. But if I were to take you back to the case of, unfortunately it happened with Mr. Avnish Bajaj, but if there were again a scenario where, let's say, a pornographic clip went up for sale, particularly, let's say, on a C2C kind of a website, OLX, Quikr, or anyone, if that unfortunate incident were to happen again, what is my advice to the client going to be? That don't do anything, please wait for even if the victim has come to you, that my integrity is at stake, I am requesting you, I am urging you to remove this content. What are we going to say? That please go find a lawyer, file a suit, get a date, an injunction is going to be passed, and only after that is served on me properly am I going to remove the content. To my mind, this is just detached from rationality. I don't think such a hyper-technical view or interpretation of the judgment needs to be taken. That judgment in the Shreya Singhal decision has been passed in a specific context where the act per se of expressing displeasure is something or is a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution. The fight in that case was whether a curtailment of that right under 19(2) of the Constitution is valid or not. But in this case, what we are doing is we are starting with something that per se amounts to an offense under 292 of the Indian Penal Code. So therefore, it is like chalk and cheese. You can't compare the two situations together and come up with a result which is completely detached from rationality. So my request to everyone when we are dealing with the liability of an intermediary is to make sure that we don't paint all intermediaries in the same brush and start taking views which are hyper-technical in nature and may not be completely in sync with a sensitive humanity that we all believe that we should be living in.
Thank you, Tushar, for that. If I just may very quickly go to Shweta, moving on from the liability issues, can I just take us back to bricks and mortar and FDI? I appreciate that the regulations are obviously very different, and I understand that the Indian Retail Association in particular have raised questions about the regulation of the market. What are your views on that, and do you think that regulation is essentially a cloak for the maintenance of the status quo? Thank you.
Really pinpointing on any marketplace, but what they want is parity between online and offline retail sector. And I hope, right now I think it's with the government, and the outcome of it I'm hoping will be progressive and it won't be regressive in this whole thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Anubhav, just a very quick question to you. I mean, in relation to the validity of these transactions, from a personal perspective, I often find it that my bank rings me up all the time and they tell me that my signature on a check doesn't match my digital signature that I have on record. And I can tell you that it can be quite infuriating sometimes when I have to rewrite the checks. Do you think there's scope to rationalize the application of things like one-time passwords, digital signatures, and other forms of validation? Is it possible just to have one?
Most certainly. In fact, I mentioned about Schedule 2 being, there needs to be some information provided in there in addition to the reliability criteria being satisfied. That is blank since 2009. And considering that, banks have been doing these transactions, obviously, I'll accept this, banks have a certain amount of benefit under the RBI regulations because the RBI has been empowered in the Banking Regulation Act to pass directions to banks. They have gone into great detail and specified how banks can allow these transactions, what level of encryption is required, how they should keep the transaction server separate from FTP servers and email servers so that there is no additional flow of information happening there. Right? I mean, it's not impossible to try and recognize this and acknowledge this and put it in Schedule 2. Obviously, this is something which banks have been through the Indian Banks Association, which is a representative body to the RBI. We have been trying to achieve this time and again. We've made representations, but it does not seem to have worked yet. So I believe even other e-commerce companies can look to try and do some sort of a lobbying to try and push the government and have standardized processes laid down for all sorts of online transactions, because the kind of security required is more or less, it cannot be different for one product as compared to the other. I mean, the platform on which we are now, what we are discussing, it should not be very different is what I believe.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think on that note, we're running short of time. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question? Gentleman at the back, please.
My name is Aruna. I'm representing. My question is to Abhinav and Rachit. We are talking about e-commerce, and the entire concept is disrupting the supply chain and all those things. And we discussed here with regard to the payment, e-payment and all those things. One thing I would like to point out here that recently RBI has issued, as we all know, payment banks and small bank guidelines. And the payment bank, on the form, it looks like it is for the inclusion of the society, and it is coming from a Nichiket More committee. But substance, when I read through the regulations, it looks like very futuristic. Like it has to be a very high technology driven bank, low cost, transaction cost and all, which I think quietly merge with the e-commerce company. And I think this may act as a big disruption for the financial banks, traditional banks, in relation to the e-commerce transaction. Your view on that?
Yeah, so I guess when Mr. Shroff and Mr. Bahel were initially addressing the audience, I guess this is the time of disruption. And you are going to see a lot of, you definitely see the ingenuity of businesses. The moment you tell them no, they start thinking. There are a lot of engineers who are gainfully employed with these e-commerce companies. And they cannot accept no